All right, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Barcoding in Microsoft Dynamics NAV, brought to you by ArcherPoint and Dynamic Manufacturing Solutions. Barcoding for labor, material, or production is a truly must-have technology for most projects involving anything to do with inventory. With today's technology, there's no reason to be afraid of embracing a barcoding solution as long as you know what to watch out for. This session will review available technologies, common problems to watch out for in projects, and what you can expect once you're live. Our presenter today is Mark Hamblin, President of Dynamic Manufacturing Solutions, a software development and consulting firm specializing in add-ons for Dynamics NAV. Mark spent many years working in manufacturing and distribution before leveraging that experience to create software for those industries. As part of his software development career, Mark also taught computer engineering at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology and was recently voted one of its top 50 alumni since its founding. Mark also sits on various boards of direction for software development and manufacturing programs. In just under an hour, Mark will cover topics including which hardware deployment options make sense, the differences, advantages, and disadvantages of 2D and linear barcodes, real-time versus batch mode scanning, the scalability of NAV, security for handhelds, and more. We will have a Q&A at the end of Mark's presentation. You can either type your questions in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar console as we go along, or use the raise your hand option to ask your question verbally. I will announce the person asking the question and unmute your line at that time. So let's go ahead and get started. Mark, over to you.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for the introduction, Suzanne. We'll get going right away. All right. So as was mentioned, we're going to go through and talk a little bit about what you need to worry about if you're going to be implementing a barcoding solution. So we're going to discuss why, and if you're on this call, you probably already know why, but we'll go through that. The different types of solutions that are out there that may be of interest to you or may be the most suitable for your needs, how to select the hardware and software, and generally the issues you need to look out for when you're about to deploy a solution, what you need to prepare for. And then finally, how you use the system or what you can do to leverage the system once it's live. Okay. And as was mentioned, if you have any questions, you can type them in as we're going. We'll cover off any questions at the end of the presentation. All right. So let's get started. All right, first thing, why? Why do you need barcoding? So the reason is everybody on the call has electronic data. I mean, you're running NAV, you've got electronic data in your system. And, inventory levels, POs, all of those sorts of things. And all of that data is really a competitive advantage to you, right? I mean, that's really why you got NAV or you got an ERP system, is because you wanted to capture that information, capture that data, report on it, turn it into information. And that's why business intelligence solutions are so popular now, right? Like, you need to be able to get that data into the system and then report on it to generate information and actionable details. But in order to do that reporting, we need to be able to get that data in the system properly in the first place. It needs to be timely and accurate. And the problem with that is when we're talking about shop floor or warehouse is really keeping that physical world of your warehouse and your shop in sync with the virtual world that you have in NAV, right? So NAV knows that you have inventory and all those sorts of things. And we want to keep that synchronized as much as possible with what you physically have in stock, right? So today, if you're running a paper-based system, you're going to have a lot of issues doing that. Things like, people losing paperwork. Something comes in for receipt, they mark up the packing slip, and they lose that packing slip, and it doesn't get handed in, and NAV doesn't know the material has arrived. And then the delayed transactions. They find that paper later, but in the meantime, purchasers have been chasing vendors and reordering and expediting because they don't think the material has arrived. So that costs you money. And then even just writing down the wrong quantities and things like that on a piece of paper will will cause issues. So this all adds fairly significant cost to your operations, right? So, I mentioned a couple of these just a second ago, but, inventory overstock, if you don't get the receipt in on time, it's quite possible that you expedite new material to come in because you don't know you have it. If your inventory is inaccurate, you're going to do the same thing. Are you losing shipping paperwork and then not invoicing people on time? All of those sorts of things are actually going to cost you, fairly significant amounts of money, right? So clearly, this is something we want to correct. And the way we do that is to get that data into the system in a more timely and accurate manner. And obviously, because of the title of this session, we're going to talk about barcoding to do that. Now, there's lots of technologies. RFID works in some cases. There's various other mechanisms for getting data into the system, some automation, and depending on the machinery you're using, that sort of thing. But generally, barcoding is the most accessible and cost-effective technology out there. I mean, it's been around for 50, 60 years, whatever it is, and it's fairly mature and widely available. So it's a good choice for automated data collection. So anything that you do within your environment, you can typically record using a barcode and a scanner. And what that does is really improve your timeliness and your accuracy of the data coming into your NAV system, right? And the right tools are going to allow you to prevent errors at the time of that physical transaction. So, a receipt comes in as an example, just to continue with that. Somebody scans that barcode. If you were shipped the wrong product, it's going to yell at you at that point. Whereas on a paper-based system, you might look at the box and just check it off and not realize it's a different product. So really, you're going to dramatically improve the accuracy of the information and the timeliness of when it's recorded. Now, that's the data capture side. Just getting the information into NAV, or the data into NAV, is the first part of it. But we need to be able to do more than that, really. I mean, it's 2015. Just collecting data should be, a given. What we really need to worry about is once we have that data in the system, we need to turn that into information. And right now, that happens, right? The data comes in, you do a pick, or you do a receive, or an inventory count, and you get that into NAV, and then you can do reports on it, which turn that raw data into some information that you can act on. But you're doing that all in NAV, right? So the data comes in from the shop floor, you're sitting in NAV and doing that. And the problem with that is a lot of those decisions should be made on the shop floor. So somebody's trying to pick a product as an example, and it isn't there. It isn't in the bin that was specified. Rather than writing that product and that bin on the back of their hand and an hour later going to talk to the supervisor about it, they should be able to make some of those decisions on the shop floor and decide what they're going to do. Okay, and that's really when you're looking at barcoding, you need to look at it for more than just simple data acquisition. You need to look at it as to how are you going to enable the guys on the shop floor make decisions and improve their effectiveness out there. Okay? So that shop floor decision support is a big aspect of it. And I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean by that. So let's say, we're talking about both material and labor barcoding in this session. So if we're looking at labor barcoding as an example, you might bring up a screen that lists all the activities that are outstanding on the shop floor right now. And that's not a bad start. Guys can see what they're supposed to do, and they can clock onto the jobs of the barcode and all that kind of stuff. That's really not enough. What would be really nice is if we had something like that, where it tells them, what material is required, to what level of quality they need to work toward, any work instructions or documents that will aid them in the production of that product, right? So we're doing more than just capturing the time they're spending on the job. We're giving them the information they need to make decisions about how they're going to work. So that's, sort of on the labor and manufacturing side. If we switch over to sort of the material handling side, an example, I mentioned a pick. Somebody goes in and they've got a pick on the handheld and they scan and, the product isn't there. What do? You write it down and talk to a supervisor an hour later to figure out what's going on. Well, maybe you can hit item inquiry and drill down on that particular line on the pick to find out more information about that particular product. And maybe do things like bring up a picture. You know, you scan the item and it doesn't match the description, so maybe you want to look at a picture of what it looks like, or, you know, as it shows here, you know, recent transactions or details, maybe where else that item might exist, right? Or click on there to add a notification that gets sent to the supervisor's role center so you can deal with these things in real time. So that's what I mean by that shop floor decision support, providing the information to the guys out on the shop floor rather than isolating it within NAV in somebody's office where, you know, it's not going to help anybody during their daily activities. All right. Now, given that we want to do more than just, you know, straight data collection, what are our options? So there's a few different types of or classifications of software that you can run to enable barcode data collection. So in-house development, and we'll go through all of these in a sec here. In-house development, built-in NAV capabilities, framework add-ons that are out there, so third-party add-ons you can install, and dedicated third-party add-ons that you can install. Okay. So let's look at in-house development first. All right, so you have a need. You want to be able to do receiving, let's say, with barcoding. Well, one option is, you know, you have an in-house developer who's very happy. As you can see, he's got a huge smile there. Very happy to do development. And he's going to go and write you an app for the handheld device that's going to let you receive product, and that's great. And you have a very specific receiving process, and, you know, maybe not using item tracking or anything like that. And especially with the later versions of NAV, it's actually pretty easy to whip together a tool that can do, you know, some of those point type processes. So, you know, it is easy, and he likes programming, so that might be something that your guys advocate in-house to, oh, we just build it ourselves. The problem with that is it typically does only meet a very small slice of the actual warehouse process. So there's less functionality generally than some of the other options. You know, sort of non-intuitively, it actually takes longer to develop this. You know, you can whip together something in a couple of days maybe, but by the time you deploy it and test it and everything, it's actually going to take longer than sort of an add-on or a built-in NAV functionality that's proven and that there's documentation for and everything else. And that leads to typically a higher cost than other solutions. So if you're looking at another solution and it's X thousands of dollars and you've got an in-house guy that says he can whip something up in a few days, you're thinking, well, it's basically free if we do it in-house versus a few $1,000s to buy it. Well, generally it's going to hurt you more to do an in-house solution, right? It's the classic do I buy or build. In this case, building is often not the best approach. Yeah, but it does depend on your environment and what your actual needs are. And I'll just give you an example. This is an actual version of an in-house app where they've tried to mimic what was sort of base NAV ADCS because they weren't using the direct-to-pick stuff, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it's very specific to that particular need, and it has limitations. So, for example, it runs an Internet Explorer on the handheld because it's just a web-based page. And when you select a field, you know, you get the keyboard pop up and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little uglier to use, but you know, it meets you know, their particular needs in this case. So that's a little example of what you can do with in-house development. Okay. The next one I'll go through is the NAV ADCS tool. So if you're running 2013 or higher, you already own this. So you've got it. It's free. It comes with it. And it's actually pretty easy to get running. So, you know, I've done it a number of times. I can get ADCS up and running in about 10 minutes. And I fire up my handheld, and bang, I've got access to barcode stuff in NAV. It's pretty cool. The downsides, and there are a few, it's a terminal emulation, which means it's a text-based user interface. And I'll show you some examples of that in a sec. Usually when I say text-based, people aren't sure what I mean by that. But the user interface isn't necessarily as robust or comprehensive or as nice to use as some of the other options. If you're not running 2013 or higher, it's actually a fairly expensive module to buy and implement. So that's a consideration as well. It doesn't handle a number of fairly common requirements like item tracking. So if you have lot numbers or serial numbers that aren't warehouse tracked, if you know what that means, it doesn't handle that really at all. So often there's a lot of customization required to make it work for a specific environment. And one of the big ones is it requires the use of something called directed pick and put away in NAV. So that's a setting that you turn on a location which forces a specific warehouse process. So it's the advanced warehousing in NAV is what that refers to. And a lot of people don't want to use that because it adds a fair amount of overhead in the process and other things. And in order to use ADCS, you need to have that enabled. So that's a definite downside to ADCS. Okay? So again, pros, it's free, easy to get set up and running. Downsides, you need the directed put away, and you're dealing with a text-based interface. So text-based interface, let's see what that looks like. So when I say it's a terminal emulation or a text-based interface, this is what we're talking about. And what that is it's a menu. If I want to get into the put aways as an example, I have to hit 2 on the touchpad on the handheld and hit enter, and that'll load up my list of put aways or picks. And then from there, I have to do other things. So if we contrast that to one that's more of a graphical user interface, this would be an example of a menu on a graphical user interface tool. Okay, so it's a little different. It's a little more modern, a little nicer potentially to look at and to use. But it's both are just menus. So if we look at when I actually open up a pick document on ADCS, and these are actual ADCS screens. So if you install ADCS and get it up and running, this is what you'd see. We can see that we see a single operation, so a take operation from this bin for this item, and we have to scan everything in order, and we have to make sure the right fields are selected before we scan. And it's fairly limited information, right? It steps you through one activity at a time, and that's what it does. For that use case, it actually works very well, but it's still a fairly limited interface. So in contrast, a pick interface, this is the same screen you saw before. A pick interface on sort of a GUI type version gives you a lot more information, right? So it gives you a little more context around what's going on, like how big is this pick? How many items do I have left to pick? You've got the ability to drill down. You see descriptions. All of those sorts of things make it a much more usable system than a text-based tool. Okay, so that's what I mean by text-based. And as I said, what you see here is the NAV ADCS. If you install it after this call, and however long it takes, half an hour, since it's the first time you've done it, this is what you would see. All right. Now, the next type of classification for tools that you can use are what we would call framework add-ons. And these are tools that provide you a bit of an infrastructure for building your own solutions. So, and some of them come with pre-canned warehouse solutions already set up. So what this would allow you to do is go into NAV and build some screens within the NAV user interface and tie it to some custom business logic and all those sorts of things. And you can basically build your own application with it, which is kind of cool. The other thing where it adds value is that, maybe we're talking warehouse right now, but maybe you want your outside sales guys to be able to do things like look up customers and that sort of thing. Well, you could, on that same framework, potentially build an application to allow them to do that. So, those are pretty cool features. Now, the downside is that, they're normally targeted towards sort of a touchscreen app, so like a phone app and things like that, which means that the user interface is often not ideal for warehouse use. It requires you to swipe and tap and do all sorts of things on the screen, when really your process in the warehouse should be scan a barcode, optionally enter a quantity, and move on, not tap the screen and do this and that. I mentioned those sort of pre-canned solutions that are available. Some of them lack depth, and what I mean by that is, sure, they can do a pick, but what happens if now you have item tracking, so lot numbers turned on? Does it handle that? And does it handle it if you've got warehouse lot tracking turned on? And what happens if you predefine the lot numbers you need to pick versus letting the guys on the shop floor pick the lot numbers? most of them will not handle those types of scenarios, right? They just don't have that depth. So that means that even though these are sort of, build your own solution within the NAV user interface, they often will require additional development to make them work even for, fairly common use cases in the warehouse or on the shop floor. Okay, but they are a decent option when looking for a solution. They can be extended to do quite a bit. Okay. The next one is sort of a more specific version of those framework add-ons, where what it is, it's really a dedicated solution. So it's purpose-built for warehouse or shop floor activity. Okay, so it's purpose-built to manage material in warehouse, or purpose-built to track labor and time and attendance and all those things in a shop floor. And the advantage of that is, there's lots of versions out there for text or text-based. They're generally the most cost-effective because they're designed to do what you want them to do. There's no messing around with them typically to make them manage the standard use cases. I mean, if you have some existing customizations and things like that, maybe there's some work. But generally, they're going to plug in and they're going to work for you out of the box. The deep capabilities, as I mentioned, the good ones will handle all of those different variations in your processes and manage them properly. The downside is really the strength of those framework add-ons we just talked about, where you can really customize the heck out of them quite easily. The downside on these dedicated ones, they're a little more locked down, specifically for the reason that they are intended to, solve a specific problem. The decent ones that are out there will let you, modify the user interface, change things around, add your own business logic, all of those sorts of things. So they still provide that flexibility, but they're not quite as flexible as those framework type add-ons. Okay? So a couple screenshots. You've seen both of those screenshots before, but those are examples of dedicated add-ons. So the one in the background, that's a dedicated add-on for capturing time and attendance and labor and things like that. It understands NAV, it understands production orders and jobs and everything else. It knows what it's doing. You plug it in, and it effectively works. And on the handheld is more material management with some production-related stuff. And again, you plug it into NAV regardless of what your configuration is. It understands what it's supposed to do, and it just works in general. All right, another thing to consider when choosing your software is batch versus real-time. So most of these categories will support either batch or real-time, or offline or real-time is another way of looking at it. With the exception of NAV ADCS is always real-time. It needs a Wi-Fi connection. So generally, the real-time option is the preferred option. And the reason is you're going to get that real-time feedback you need when you're performing these transactions. So when I'm physically doing something, at that point in time, I want to tell NAV what I'm doing. So NAV understands in real time what's happening on the shop floor. That's the ideal situation. Okay. To do that, you do need a good Wi-Fi network. You do need to have, the ability for these devices to communicate with your NAV server. With the batch mode or the offline processing, you can't really control, cross that bridge between the physical and the virtual world. So for example, I could go out there and scan a bunch of stuff, like I'm going to move product from one bin to another, and if it's not communicating with NAV, it might let me do that no problem. And then when I try and sync it up with NAV, it says, hey, you're not allowed to do that because NAV says, based on this business logic, you're not allowed to move that product. Well, now what do? Do you go back and physically move the stuff back? Do you have to sit there in NAV and try and figure out how to correct it? It becomes a bit of a challenge. Whereas with real time, the guy gets the error while he's trying to perform that physical operation, and he can make the corrections right at that point. Okay. Now, where batch mode or offline is useful is, if you do have a network failure, you should be able to record transactions via barcode without worrying about that connectivity. And if you have, vendor-managed inventory or consignment inventory, or you want your sales guys to go out and count inventory at retail locations, those sorts of things, batch mode or offline is actually very useful, right? So any solution you get that you need that type of capability, you need to make sure that that solution supports some sort of offline or batch processing capability. Okay, and just a couple screenshots. So, you know, this is sort of the same application, but this is sort of an offline mode here on the left-hand side. And you can see it's scanned basically the same information where it's moving from one bin to another. And here, it just, you know, it happily lets you scan whatever you want because it has no ability to validate that against NAV because it's offline. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's actually validating it as I'm trying to perform this operation. And for those of you who know NAV error messages, that's a very typical, you know, NAV error message. But you can see that that is actually a NAV error message that's presented back to the device that tells me that, you know, I've got an available quantity in that bin of less than 120, so I can't do what I'm telling the system I'm trying to do. Right? So you get that real-time feedback, and at this point, you know, you can make the corrections that are required. Okay? So that's real-time versus batch. Okay. So, you know, that's the software side of things. So when you go through this, you need to, of course, decide on what software, what type of software makes the most sense for you, whether it's in-house, NAV ADCS, a framework add-on that you sort of build out your own solution, or a dedicated add-on. You know, not everybody is going to fit into one specific bucket. You know, you sort of need to evaluate what's best for you. And then you need to also decide on hardware, which we'll get into in a second here. Barcode strategy is another important aspect that we'll talk about. And then how you're going to deploy it internally or via cloud-based solution. How you engage your IT department. We talked a little bit about Wi-Fi, how important that is if you have a real-time connection. You need to deal with that. And then the process change that's going to come along with implementing a barcode solution. Okay. Let's start with the hardware side of things. So when you're looking at hardware, what you want to look at depends on sort of the application that you're using within your environment. You can use dedicated handhelds, and that's, you know, one of these, you know, sort of standard scanner type units that you've seen, I'm sure, before. Dedicated handhelds. There's phones and tablets, and fixed terminals with these what we call wedge scanners, like a USB scanner. And as I mentioned, the type of hardware you choose is normally dependent on what you're going to use that for. If you're in the warehouse, you want a dedicated rugged scanner. You don't want to use anything else. It's not really worth the effort, with the exception of hardened tablets are actually a decent option. But from an ergonomic point of view and a ruggedness point of view, you want to use sort of these hardened scanners. Right? I've seen these things get run over by forklifts and keep working. I've even seen some with cracked screens that guys keep working for you know, for ages until they get them replaced. If you've got outside sales guys or vendor managed inventory or whatever, where the guy, you know, he has this amazing computer in his pocket already on his phone, you know, it's actually very useful to be able to leverage that to scan inventory and use it for barcode scanning outside of the shop environment. And then the fixed terminals are best for fixed workstations. So when you're doing, you know, labor tracking and time and attendance and things like that, then fixed terminals are your best bet. So that's, you know, a station where you've got, you know, basically a mini computer or a thin client and a monitor with the wedge scanner is best. Okay. So again, these are kind of your options, and the one you choose really depends on your usage. If you're in a warehouse or a shop situation, the hardened scanner is the way to go. Okay. And just some pictures of the different options out there. So these little guys on the left are what you would often use for fixed terminals. So if you're doing time collection, you know, this guy, this HP guy here is what we call a Chrome box, and it's a couple $100, and you plug in a monitor, and it just fires up and it works, and there's no moving parts or anything like that. So it's a great solution. The guy on the left, this Wise terminal here, that's a thin client. If you're running Citrix or VMware, that'll connect up, and again, no moving parts or anything like that. So you can bury either of these guys in sand, and they'll keep working. So great solution for a shop. You know, the rugged devices, you know, for the warehousing, right? Pistol grip or not, those types of options. This tablet here is actually a pretty slick unit. It's a Motorola tablet. It's a 7-inch tablet that's hardened. It's actually as rugged as some of these scanner devices. Built-in barcode scanner, RFID, things like that are available to it, or for it. So, you know, if you wanted a larger display area for bringing up documents and things like that, we see that being used for QC guys. That's actually a very nice alternative. And then this little guy here is actually it's an Android phone that has a built-in, you know, it's actually a Motorola scanning unit, so for scanning 2D barcodes. So there's lots of different options there depending on what you want to do. All right, so you've chosen your software, you've looked at these pretty pictures and said, I want that hardware, and you've got your hardware. The next thing to decide, actually you almost have to decide this before the hardware, is what is my strategy for putting barcodes on the things I need to scan. So number one question is usually, you know, is your product already barcoded? Does your vendor put barcodes on the product for you? And if so, what type of barcode is it? Is it a GS1? Is it a UPC code? Is it something, you know, just a code 39? You know, there's lots of different types of barcodes out there. And that has some impact on the solution you deploy. So for example, a decent solution could take a GS1 barcode, which includes you know, an item number, a lot number, and an expiration date or unit of measure, and scan that one barcode and extract all that information at one time. Okay, so some of that may have an impact on the software you choose as well. But again, checking to see if the vendor is going to label the product for you. If they're not, and you're going to put the labels on, when do you put those labels on? Do you put it on during receiving? You just have the labels on the bin itself? If you're manufacturing the product, do you put the labels on, you know, some of the components before you run them through production, or do you put it on the finished goods after? Those types of things. The 2D and 1D is another good question. And what you see over here, this linear barcode, you know, the standard barcode that you see typically, that's what we call a linear or 1D barcode. And they're fairly limited. They can encode a very limited amount of information. So a barcode the size you see on the screen there is maybe 5 or 6 characters is what I can encode in that. And the typical ones you don't see more than about 10 characters, otherwise they get way too big. Down below that, you see a couple of examples of a 2D barcode. In this case, it's a data matrix barcode. And data matrix is really the future for industrial barcodes. And you know, in about a quarter-inch square barcode, I can put about 20 characters of data in a quarter-inch square barcode. So something that goes out to about an inch square, I can put, you know, maybe 100 characters of data into that 1-inch barcode. So that makes it ideal for putting lot numbers and item numbers and expiration dates or manufacturing dates, almost anything you want within that barcode. Okay, and there's a lot of advantage to that, especially, you know, if you're doing offline processing. A lot of that information is already in the barcode. It doesn't have to go to NAV to look it up. It's just got it right there. Downside of that is, you know, if your clients, if your downstream users need to be able to scan barcodes, they may only have the ability to scan the 1D barcodes. So, you know, there might be a decision there to use 1D just because your customers need 1D. Some of the questions that you'll want to ask are, you know, are you going to make it mandatory to scan barcodes? And that, you know, helps you decide whether you need to label everything or just some things. And what media will the labels be on? So if you're working in, say, a freezer environment, that's a very different type of label material than if you're working in just a, you know, a dry goods warehouse. Or if you want to scan from a distance, so if you want your forklift guys to scan bin barcodes that are 20 feet up in the air, that's probably a different type of label material than you're going to use than if you're scanning at close range. Okay. So those are some of the decisions that you need to make and talk about when you're discussing the barcode strategy. One of the most important things you need to do as you get into this is the engagement with your IT department. Okay, so in a lot of these implementations, the IT guys are almost the last to know. You know, the NAV people go out and decide, yep, this is the solution we're going to do. We're going to buy that hardware. And then, you know, the hardware shows up and they walk it over to the IT department and say, okay, get this set up. And the IT guys are lost. Okay, and that happens all the time. Or they say, hey, you know, I can't scan something at the far corner of my warehouse because the IT guys never knew to extend the Wi-Fi out that far. Okay, so really get the IT guys engaged well ahead of time, you know, almost near the start of the selection process, right? So that they know what's coming, they know what they're going to need to have to do for Wi-Fi and device management. Okay. Speaking of Wi-Fi, proper coverage throughout the shop. Again, if you want real-time communication, that's almost a must. If you're willing to live with some offline and some real-time, maybe you don't need to have full coverage, but really full coverage is the ideal solution. And it's not that expensive nowadays to get that set up. You don't need a ton of access points if it's done properly, and wiring up a warehouse is really not that expensive anymore. Okay. And if you're running older devices, if you're not buying new hardware as far as the scanners and things like that, you'll definitely want to test your Wi-Fi network with those devices to make sure that the security and everything is compatible with your network. Okay. And this is up to the IT guys, but what we often recommend is a completely separate network, Wi-Fi network, just for the shop users. So don't leverage the network that the guys in the office are using. Create a separate network just for the shop that you can manage independently. All right, so we've got the software, we've got the hardware, we've got the Wi-Fi, the IT guys are loving this, everything's set up, and we're ready to go. So what's next? Well, process change. So you're going to run into a lot of things that are going to change in your environment, okay? And some examples of those are, if you go and put in a shop floor and time and attendance solution, what's going to happen is you're going to eliminate a full-time position most likely. The person that used to enter all that information into the system is no longer required. So what are they going to do? You're going to have to get them to do something, and you need to be aware of that ahead of time, because if they're involved in the project, pretty soon they're going to start thinking, well, when this starts up, I won't have a job. What's going to happen? So those types of things. That shop floor data collection also gives you better visibility into what's happening. So now maybe you can start using finite capacity scheduling, or providing portals for your customers to show them where things are in the manufacturing process, those types of things. So it's a whole bunch of things that can open up for you once it's in place. Okay, and that's on the time and attendance and the shop floor data capture. If we look at material barcoding, it might make sense now to start using the advanced warehouse documents, so warehouse receipts, warehouse shipments, and things like that you didn't want to use before because they added overhead. Well, now that overhead gets sort of eliminated when you're doing simple barcode scanning. And the same thing with item tracking. We see this a lot. People want to track serial numbers, they want to track lot numbers, but it's just too hard to write them down on a piece of paper. Well, now that you're scanning, you can actually start doing that, and you can start leveraging the lot number and serial number capabilities within NAV. Okay. All right. So you've gone in, everything's set up, you've identified all the processes that are changing, you've done that, and now you're live and everything is going. So the nice thing about barcoding is once it's up and running, it generally just works, right? It runs, it does what it's supposed to do, and away it goes. However, you might start out with sort of leveraging the same processes that you're using today in the shop, implement barcoding, and then down the road you'll realize, well, I can do so much more. So some of the things I just talked about, like item tracking and enabling directed pick potentially to improve the efficiency of the picking process, and those types of things might be something to consider as you're going through your post-go-live phase. Okay, so that all sounds pretty good, but what can you expect as far as return on investment for doing barcoding? We talked about right at the beginning what it's costing you to have mistakes being made. What happens when you implement a barcoding solution? So a couple of just sort of anecdotal case studies here that we've seen. First one on an inventory management. A client implemented a barcoded inventory solution with an advanced inventory count module within the scanners, and it paid for itself after the first count. So they dropped their count from an average of 7 or 8 days down to 2 days. So you think about all the labor savings and all the time savings involved in that, and that system paid for itself after the very first inventory count they did. Okay. The other one is shop floor data collection. Client implemented that, and the entire system, including all the hardware and the shop terminals, paid for itself in less than 6 months. And that's actually very easy to calculate because a lot of those savings come with data entry savings. So you can say, well, I've got somebody that spends, X number of hours a week doing data entry. That all just disappears. So often we see that where it's 3 to 6 months and the system pays for itself entirely. Okay. So those are some, just a couple actually fairly common examples of the sort of return on investment you can get by implementing a barcoding solution. And now the costs. So what does it cost you to implement a barcoding solution? So there's several costs associated with it. There's software, there's hardware, there's implementation, and then there's the internal costs of training and process change and all those sorts of things. But let's talk specifically now about the software side. So Archer Point has got a couple of promotions going. So first one, there's a bundle price where you can get 2 handheld devices and all the software required to run those 2 handheld devices for your warehouse. It does include some of the advanced functionality, like I mentioned, advanced inventory count and things like that. But basically everything you need to do picks, receipts, shipments, all that kind of stuff, and that's $5,000. So that's, and there's the big asterisk on that for, there's implementation on top of that and those sorts of things. But really your starting point is about $5,000 to get everything you need to try out a barcoded warehouse solution. If you're mostly just interested in doing your inventory counts via barcodes, then another option is just a bundle where you get the same type of hardware, but you get the advanced inventory count module to do your inventory counts through barcoding, and that one is $4,500. And then if you're looking at time and attendance or shop floor data collection and integration with payroll and all that kind of stuff, there's a number of different options out there for that type of software, and there's a 15% discount on that type of software. Okay, so that's a little bit on the costs that you might be facing on the software side. If you need specific costs or anything like that, just call your Archer Point guy, and they'll hook you up with a quote. All right. So any questions? We're going to go through and ask whatever questions you have, and hopefully there's something out there.
All right, thanks, Mark. Good information. First question I have is, I have existing scanners, and will they work with the options that you outlined?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Existing scanners will work with a lot of those options. ADCS will work on almost all of those, though sometimes there's additional software to buy, terminal emulation software you need to buy to run on it. But anything that's relatively newer, like let's say 2008 and up, will work with most of those solutions.
All right, great. And then we have Anton on the line. He is utilizing NAV, but their 3PL uses another product, and he was wondering, Synapse. I was wondering if there's any compatibilities with this solution and that.
Yeah, that's a good question. When we're dealing with 3PL, you have a couple of options. Normally with 3PL, what we would do is just integrate that Synapse system with NAV, and then they'd use their own barcoding solution to feed the data into that, and we'd extract that and pull it into NAV. If they don't have a barcoding solution, then yes, you could leverage something like this with NAV for that 3PL use. But it would be probably a larger discussion than what we can cover in this session here. Best bet is to contact your Archer Point rep and see what they say.
Yeah, so we'll follow up with you after the webinar. And then a couple questions from Berlinda. She asks, is the NAV ACDS, is that the one that comes with NAV, or is that a third party?
No, it comes with NAV. So again, with 2013 and up, it's no cost. If it's 2009 and older, there is a more significant cost for it. But yes, the one I was showing there is the base one with NAV. There are add-ons, like there's a number of ISVs and actually other people that have sort of customized that a little bit. But the basic one is free with NAV.
All right, and then from John, he'd like to know what operating systems are required on the mobile devices.
Again, it depends on the type of option. So ADCS will run on pretty much any operating system as long as you have a terminal emulator on it, which is often an extra cost. The others generally require Windows CE 6 and up, but Windows Mobile is preferred on those devices. So Windows Mobile 6 and up is the preferred one.
All right, thanks. Yes, and Tim reiterated that there's no cost for ADCS if they are on the extended pack for NAV 2013 or higher. So if you're on that version, then that is no cost with the pros and cons that were outlined earlier. Kurt asked, he said they're looking at scanners for a mobile fleet of service trucks across the country. Do you have any recommendations for this scenario from a hardware, software standpoint? He said that their drivers carry jetpacks for hotspots and Wi-Fi boosting.
Yeah, so that's another one that probably needs a little more discussion. So any of those software solutions mentioned there, with potentially the exception of ADCS, would likely work, you know, for, I don't know if it's field service or delivery or whatever, but they typically work with that. As far as hardware goes, I mean, if they have phones already, that might be the way to go. However, you might want something more rugged, and in that case, you can get sort of hardened units that include phone and GPS and scanner and everything built in for around $500 a piece per truck, right? So that might be an option to look at.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Kurt. A couple questions about NAV ADCS. Bill wants to know if it can be used for scanning and receiving and shipping.
It can, but you have to have the directed pick turned on, and what that means is you have to use warehouse receipts and warehouse shipments with it, and you'd also need a little bit of potential customization to handle that shipping and receiving from it. Actually, I shouldn't say potential. You would need to do some work to make it work properly with those documents. By default, it's meant to work sort of inside the warehouse, and shipping and receiving are sort of on the edge of the warehouse.
And then Leah wanted to confirm that ADCS does not have lot control, correct?
Out of the box, no, it doesn't. The only thing it really supports is warehouse tracked serial numbers, which means you have to know which bin a serial number is in order to make use of that functionality.
Great.
So ADCS is fairly limited. It supports a very limited set of use cases.
Okay. And then John, just to answer your question, yes, you do have to have the extended pack for NAV 2013.
Yes.
It doesn't work in the starter.
Sorry, I didn't mention that. Yeah, the starter pack, ADCS is included in the starter pack. You do need the extended pack to get ADCS.
Correct. And then for Belinda, if you could review what was in the WMS bundle again, please.
Sure. So the WMS bundle, 2 devices. So those are sort of top-of-the-line 2D barcode scanning devices. I think the retail price on them is about $1,900 a piece. You get a charger for it, and the software you get includes shipping, receiving, picks, putaways, movements, production, offline scanning, and inquiry. So you get pretty much everything you need to do the warehouse. And then on top of that, there would be the annual enhancement and whatever implementation is required. Typically, implementation is about a day's worth of work, including installing it and training and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And that's for 2 licenses, so that would get you 2 devices and 2 licenses.
Great. And then Kurt would like you to share the PowerPoint afterwards, so we can post that on our website if I just send it over to me when we're done here. And everybody will also get notification of access to the recording of this event as well. I think that's all the questions we have. So I want to thank everybody for setting aside time out of their busy day for this webinar. We hope you consider it time well spent To help us to continue to offer value, we'd like to ask you to take a few more minutes just to give us your feedback and suggestions for topics you would like covered in future Lunch and Learn webinars. Simply email your comments to info@archerpoint.com. That's info@archerpoint.com. Again, thanks for your time. This concludes today's session. Thanks so much, Mark. Have a great afternoon, everyone.